Dr. Ellison, we can go ahead and get started. I'm sure Dr. Grant will be joining us shortly. Welcome, everyone, and I would like to introduce Dr. Ellison, who will be moderating this panel. Dr. Ellison, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dean Holly Walker. Good morning, and welcome to today's panel on Black women, suffrage, and the false promise of equality. I am Constance Ellison. I serve as the Senior Associate Dean of Graduate Studies here at Howard University in the Graduate School, and I will be the moderator for today's panel discussion. This panel of scholars and political leaders will discuss the highs and lows of political life for Black women in America. Today's esteemed panelists are Professor Lisa Crooms-Robinson. Professor Crooms-Robinson is a full professor at Howard University School of Law. A proud Bison, she earned her BA from Howard University and JD from the University of Michigan Law School. Professor Crooms-Robinson teaches constitutional law, international human rights, contracts, and gender and the law. She serves on the board of directors of the Center for Constitutional Rights and the U.S. Human Rights Network. Her most recent publications are Stripped, Speech, Sex, Race, and Secondary Effects, and also a commentary on Ferguson versus City of Charleston and Feminist Judgments, Reproductive Judgment Rewritten. Welcome, Professor Crooms-Robinson. Our next panelist is Dr. Keneshia Grant, who will be joining us momentarily. Dr. Keneshia Grant is an associate professor of political science at Howard University. She is author of The Great Migration and the Democratic Party, Black Voters, and the Realignment of American Politics in the 20th Century, which describes Black America's movement into the Democratic Party as a function of their migration to northern cities. Dr. Grant is also media contributor, frequently quoted in national print news outlets, and providing radio and television commentary to national and international audiences. We will welcome Dr. Grant when she joins us. Last but not least, we have Dr. Pearl Dowe from Emory University. Welcome home, Dr. Dowe.
Thank you.
Dr. Dowe is the Asa Griggs Chandler Professor of Political Science and African American Studies with a joint appointment between the university's Oxford College and Emory College of Arts and Sciences. Before joining Emory, Dr. Dowe served as Associate Professor and Department Chair in the Political Science Department at the University of Arkansas. Her most recent research focuses on African American women's political ambition and public leadership. Dr. Dowe is a graduate of Savannah State University and holds a master's degree in political science from Georgia Southern University and a PhD in political science from Howard University. She joined the faculty of University of Arkansas in 2008. In 2016, she was visiting scholar in residence at Howard University's Ron Walters Center for Public Policy. And again, welcome, Dr. Dowe. Today's session's agenda is as follows. The individual speakers will remark on the session's topic, the highs and lows of political life for Black women in America. And then we will have a panel discussion. And then finally, we will have audience questions and answers. So we can get started. How about we start with Dr. Dowe?
Okay, I knew you were going to say me first. Good morning, everyone. It's Happy Homecoming Week. I am pleased that my alma mater has asked me to participate in this wonderful event. And so I have some brief comments because I think, this is such a robust conversation, particularly in this moment, that I think we're going to have some really great dialogue. And so I just want to give a few comments about what we're seeing with Black women, particularly in this moment where all eyes are on us. And it is an interesting time because the media and expectations of Black women right now is about turnout. But I think what we are seeing about Black women is the fullness of Black women's political participation and engagement. We are seeing the ability to actually vote and turn out in high numbers, but we're also seeing the social and political capital that Black women have within their communities, particularly when it comes to mobilization and organizing. We see this primarily with um, a lot of the organizations, some are our more long-standing organizations, the sororities, the civic organizations, having a significant impact on mobilizing the community around voting, but also around the census as well. So we see a significant amount of information and voter education around getting our communities to complete the census. So we see that aspect there. But what we also see, we also have to remember is that this moment, particularly with our fellow alumna, Kamala Harris being on the ticket, is that this did not just come easily. Black women pushed for this. And I want to remind everyone that the push really didn't just begin this spring, where we saw the open letters and we saw a lot of the women who do a lot of this work in our communities constantly advocating publicly for a Black woman to be on the ticket. This really goes back years, but I think one of the most recent moments that we can point to is in 2017, when there was a public letter to the Democratic Party stating that the party had not addressed the needs of Black women, and pretty much that they were pretty much using the work of Black women without providing resources. So they knew the Democratic Party has always known that Black women will get out, they will work, they will mobilize, but they were not providing the resources to do so. And so I think that that moment really was a critical moment in reckoning for the Democratic Party, particularly in looking at the fact that this was a significant group of women who were doing the mobilization, doing the work that the party pretty much was getting for free or little or nothing. Um, and so fast forward to where we are today and looking at not just only Senator Harris, but also where Black women are in running for office. As of right now, there are 74 Black women that are on general election ballots for either a congressional seat or a state seat, such as a lieutenant governor. Of those Black women, 12 are Republican. And then there are a significant number of Black women that are running for state legislators, as well as local positions. And so I think it is an exciting time, and to think that the fact that we're going to see an increased number of Black women in Congress. Because of those 74, we have to remember that there were 122 that ran in the primaries. And so for 74 of them to make it past their primaries, whether as incumbents or running for an open seat or a competitive seat, I think is extremely significant, and it speaks to the strength of what these women are addressing. And I just want to wrap up because I know there's some things that Dr. Crooms-Robinson is going to talk about that will overlap with what I'm saying. But I think one of the things that we also have to remember is that what gives these women strength to run and win and be successful are many of the issues that I think Dr. Crooms-Robinson is going to talk about that the larger movement has ignored. Black women, when they come to the table, particularly as candidates and as activists, they're bringing about issues that are about our fullness and our humanity. So there are issues around healthcare, there are issues around discrimination, sexual harassment, issues around family, issues around the environment. All these issues Black women have constantly been placing on the table. And what we have seen historically is that when these moments come up for coalitions, particularly with white women who are advocating for women's issues, because they have ignored Black women, they're not prepared to address those issues. And so Black women are successful because we have this long-standing history of community concern and community engagement, which makes us even more ready to run, but also to win. And so I will stop there, and then I'm looking forward to having a great conversation with my fellow panelists.
Okay, Professor Crooms-Robinson.
Good morning, and happy homecoming. I mean, this is what we'll have to do with. But I appreciate the ability to sort of connect, and I'm grateful for the opportunity that Howard's pivot, right, has provided us to come together in the way that we've become very familiar with. Not just to mark homecoming, but to have some real conversation about issues that we are facing. I also want to acknowledge and thank my fellow panelists. I like hanging out with the social science and humanities crowd, in large part because I'm often dubbed doctor, even though I didn't earn that credential. But the opportunity to have what at Howard ends up being a cross-campus conversation is something that I really look forward to. In taking Dr. Dowe's lead, I just wanted to sort of add to the mix from my particular space, which is the law, some observations about where it is that we find ourselves right now. There are few among us, you would have to perhaps have lived under a rock over the past 10 months, not to know that we are celebrating the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. In DC, for example, there have been virtual and other types of opportunities to mark that. I think most moving for me was the public art installation in I think it's called the main hall, not the grand hall, the main hall of Union Station of Ida B. Wells. And she's comprised of all of these much smaller portraits of her contemporaries to mark the occasion. There have been documentaries, there have been books, not that I'm, lifting up one over the other, but I think that one exemplar is Martha Jones's Vanguard, in terms of making sure that in this centennial year, Black women aren't just sort of added to the conversation, but if you take Dr. Jones's lead, they're centered in the conversation. That the 19th Amendment would not have, in fact, been possible but for the work done by Black women who acutely understood the limitations of what the 19th Amendment promised. They knew that because of the 15th Amendment and the fact that the rights of Black men to vote had not in fact been protected, and it had in fact been stripped away, the women, the Black women involved in the work around the 19th Amendment understood that 19 would get rid of an obstacle, but it did not mean that Black women's voting rights were protected or there was a mechanism in place to enforce them. We don't see that actually until 1965. Or at least the beginning of it, that being when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was became law. But while most of us know about the 19th Amendment centennial, little attention has really been paid to the sesquicentennial of the 15th Amendment. And it seems that it's a lost opportunity to in fact make what those of us who sort of inhabit bodies of Black women know at our very core. That is, 19 is inadequate by itself. 15 is inadequate by itself. 19 and 15 get us closer to having our voting rights in particular protected, but the work that has happened since 1965 with the enactment of the Voting Rights Act demonstrates that we're far from done with the work. I was looking on Westlaw, which is a legal database. That's all that matters. It collects, among other things, cases. And the most recent voting rights case had action yesterday in the 11th Circuit, coming out of Alabama. The case is called People First of Alabama versus Merrill. And it is a case that challenges 3 provisions of Alabama's election law. One requires a notary and witness for an absentee ballot to be filled out correctly. The other requires photo ID. And the third provision restricted Alabama's ability to use for you to cast your ballot from the curb. The coalition that brought the case featured not just Black Alabamians, but disabled Alabamians, which includes Black people, we know. This coalition challenged the law within the larger and immediate context of COVID. Yesterday, the circuit court upheld the affidavit requirements and the other provision regarding absentee ballots, but struck down and there's a preliminary injunction at this point, preventing Alabama from preventing people from voting from the curb. If you look at that case as sort of like, let's say, as of today, the omega, as it were, of voting rights cases under the Voting Rights Act or implicating the Voting Rights Act, I think that if you go back to 1966, a case out of Alabama as well, and that case is White versus Crook, in some ways stands as the alpha. It stands as the alpha of voting rights cases in terms of litigating voting rights, not just as a matter of Black men being denied the right to vote, but White versus Crook represents the first time that a claim is in fact advanced that states that both Black men and Black women are being denied the right to, in this case, serve on juries in Lowndes County, Alabama. Now, you're saying, okay, but you were talking about voting, what does that have to do with juries? Well, most jurisdictions use, among other things, the voter rolls to, in fact, determine who's eligible for jury service. So if you're not registered to vote or on the voter rolls, it's highly unlikely that you, in fact, will be able to serve on a jury. But that's the main thing that struck me, right? And the way that it comes all the way through is for those who need perhaps a more pointed example of why this is important. All you have to consider is the murder of Breonna Taylor and the outcome of the grand jury. One, the AG in Kentucky is in fact an elected position. So if you can't vote, then you're not going to have an impact on who the AG is. In addition to that, the grand jury, right? Grand jury service in Kentucky is, well, the pool of people, eligible people, is pulled from licensed drivers over 18, income tax filings, which I found to be interesting, state income tax filings, and voter rolls. So in some way, we're continuing to have the same conversation over and over and over again. The same threats in some ways that existed pre-1965 continue to sort of morph in ways that make them more and more difficult to, in fact, address with the mechanisms that we have. But being at Howard, we know that sesquicentennials are just as important as centennials, right? We just celebrated, within recent memory, our own sesquicentennial. So the idea that the conversation around the 19th Amendment has proceeded as if the 15th Amendment has very little to do with what it is that we're celebrating, I think makes the point, right? And perhaps explains why the three of us, at four, if we count Dr. Ellison, are on this Zoom call at this very moment trying to have this conversation. So I'm looking forward to chatting with the two of you as we move on.
Okay, thank you, Professor Crooms-Robinson. We were just joined by Dr. Grant. Dr. Grant, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. I think I'm more fangirling at this moment. I'm very happy to be here with Dr. Dowe and Professor Crooms-Robinson. I respect both of them, highly respect their work. I understand that we're talking about Black women's suffrage and whether or not that is actually a thing. I think I come to this morning thinking about like the space between the symbolic representation and the life that we live, the kind of politics on the ground. And so I'm thinking about all the women who have been elected to be mayors of these major cities in the United States, and thinking about whether or how that turns into like real political change for the people who live in these places. And thinking about some of the barriers that folks face. And so as I think about Washington, D.C., where I live and where Howard is located, I think about the space between Muriel Bowser as a person who paints 16th Street in Black Lives Matter paint, and like whether she is constrained or how she is constrained in her ability to actually do the stuff that the folks want in the Black Lives Matter camp, whether how she is constrained as a person who has to think about developers, as she has to try to think about what it looks like to have a city that's not completely white by the time she leaves office, or mostly, it is already mostly white, but even more white by the time she leaves office. I think about the folks in Charlotte. The mayor of Charlotte is a Black woman who has to balance what she wants to do in that state with what the legislature might want to do in that state, and balance what the legislature might want to do with what the president has going on. And so I think that I'm interested to participate in this conversation. I think there's lots to talk about in terms of the space between the symbolism and what happens on the ground. I think that I don't know, it's a Howard crowd, and so it might be a little early to speculate or ask questions about what we could expect from Senator Harris. I think we're all rooting for her. I got a Kamala shirt. I should have put it on before I came, but kind of excited for her, but also worried about like, okay, well, what does this mean? And like, what are we willing to give or not give? I recognize that she is probably a bit more centrist than I am as a person, but I don't know. I think in some ways I am excited for her because of the symbolism of it, but excited because I think she goes representing views that I have. I recognize that that's not entirely true, but mostly true. And then how do I balance what I want her to do or be in terms of like, I don't know, defunding the police with what I also want her to be in terms of like the next president after Biden, hopefully. And so those are all the things that are on my mind, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, so let's get right into the conversation. So why are we here? Why are we having this conversation? Why is it necessary? What is it that the country demands of Black women in politics? What is the common thread among the three of you?
Well, I don't know if it's a common thread, but I think, maybe, let me not shoot it down before I get it out, right? I do think that this idea of symbolism, right, and how the iconography of political engagement and political progress often features Black women. Whether that translates into real power or real significant change is a whole different issue. You know, we've been home for a while, and I was actually slated for, I did take it, sabbatical. So I had sabbatical in the midst of COVID. But in January, I want to say it was on January 15th, I saw this photo in I'm old enough to say the paper, right? But on a newspaper's website. And there was this, I mean, beautiful Black woman in, I think she had on a red suit, and she's standing among all of these women, and they're so excited. And it was a story about Virginia having finally passed the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, we're going to set aside whether, is it still open for ratification? I don't think so. Somebody will snatch my woman card, right? But there was this real symbolism for me, right? Because I did a little digging. She's a young delegate. She's announced that she's running for governor. I think her last name is Carol Foy. She's hyphenated, but she's a unicorn, because if you dig a little more, her district in Prince William County is 97% white. She's a unicorn as I understand it, right? I'm veering into y'all's arena, but I think that's fairly rare. The other interesting thing about her is she was in the third class that admitted women to VMI, Virginia Military Institute, which is after Ruth Bader Ginsburg writes her opinion that strikes down VMI's sex-segregated, sex-exclusive admission. So she's been like the odd person in context where she really wasn't supposed to be, right? And as a result of that, I think that she's been able to almost build her brand. But the idea of this Black woman being heralded by women across the nation as being responsible for finally getting that last state to, in fact, ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, I just find it to be really, really interesting. I mean, I don't think that she sees it as symbolism, but when it comes down to it, what could it really be other than symbolism at this point? Women's equality is already guaranteed. The amendment isn't necessarily going to change that or change the law around women's constitutional equality. So why was it such a big deal for Virginia to make this move in light of all of the other things that Virginia has to deal with? But I think that symbolism and that disconnect between what appears to be power and what actually is power is one of the things that I think connects what we're all sort of thinking about.
I do like this conversation about symbolism. As you were talking about the fact that this woman is this unicorn, one of the things that we are seeing is that Black women are running and winning in districts that are not majority Black, right? I referenced this on a panel last week when we look at Val Demings in Florida. She has Orlando, which is a pretty affluent area, but in the campaign cycle, reporting cycle for the FEC over the summer, I think she raised like over $2 million and gave half of it to the Democratic Congressional Committee. Who does that in Florida? I mean, seriously, right? So I think we're seeing, that goes back to what my earlier point was, is that Black women have been talking about these issues that white women and white and Democratic Party has kind of said, we don't want to talk about that. But those are the issues that matter to everybody, right? And so they're better situated to deal with these issues. But I think the symbolism is important because, to Dr. Grant's point, there was an article a few weeks ago about Atlanta and Mayor Bottoms, and that there was some discontent about Black business development in the city, in the city. And so Atlanta's dealing with the same issues as every other major city, particularly around gentrification. But when you come into the city and you look at where the money is and what brings people to the city, it's not Black owned stuff, right? You're talking about sports, you're talking about beautiful facilities, you're talking about businesses, Home Depot. There's all of these, they're not Black owned Fortune 500 companies that's driving the city, right? And so what is the space that and there's a lot, and there's the issue with the homeless issue. There was major issue that the previous mayor did not adequately address, that she's had to come in and try to fix. So there's a lot there about the symbolism of who she is. She's now, what was it? Is it Elle magazine? One of the magazines that she's profiles one of the top influential women in the country. Beautiful spread, very proud to see it. But then you get down to what else is going on in the city, right? And these fine lines that people have to thread. But I think, as far as to Dr. Ellison's question about what does America expect, I think we're at a point now where what do Black women expect of America? And I think going back to what I mentioned with that letter in 2017, I think Black women have thrown down the gauntlet and said, look, it's time. It's playtime is over, right? It is time. And I think that the party and the powers that be are slowly coming around to it. One of the things that I'm interested in from a power standpoint, particularly we're talking about party politics, is what does Kamala Harris mean for the dynamics within the party, right? We haven't seen a Black chair of the DNC since Ron Brown. Now, we've had Black women chair the convention. They ran the party, the party, right? They handled that. But as far as running the party, as far as bringing in the apparatus of what we're seeing these organizations do, bringing those voices in, the progressive voices, are we going to see a shift in that leadership, right? Because when in this, I guess it's what, February, when they vote again for the next chair, are we going to see Black women considered to be at the top? Because we saw what they did to Keith Ellison, right? What are they going to do to when a Black woman's name comes up? And it'll probably be more than one Black woman as a top contender, right? So I'm very curious about that. I'm very curious about the state parties, because we don't talk enough about that. And I think we have to start talking about the state party dynamic, and especially with what we're seeing with these long lines in the state of Georgia and the Board of Elections, right? We don't think about Secretary of States and appointments to Board of Elections and local boards. They're controlling this dynamic of why at 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning, the machines aren't working. Those local board election person didn't do that. They did that. They didn't do their job, right? So I think that party piece is where I think I'm curious about where the power is going to play out. And particularly if we see a significant number of Black women win these congressional seats, continue to see Black women's voices, and there's going to be multiple demands. There's going to be, if Biden and Harris win, there's going to be demands on them. But I'm curious to see how the party responds, because I think what this moment also is exposing is just a bad representation across the board down ticket. Okay, so who's prepared to run against DeSantis? Who's prepared to run again for governor in Georgia? Who are these people? What is the party doing to get this? Because we can't wait until 2 years out to say, oh, here's the candidate for no, you've got to start now for these key seats. And so I'm really curious about how power is going to play out beyond some symbolism in the party.
I think that the nation, or at minimum, the Democratic Party expects Black women to do everything for free and in silence. And so it's like, hey, we need to save America from Donald Trump. Who's going to do it? The Black women. And so again, I want to be very clear that I'm super excited about Kamala Harris, but I really worry that if for some reason they don't pull it out, she will be blamed about the fact that like they didn't win. And it won't be a story about, oh, we were supposed to, it was a pandemic. And so usually we knock doors, we didn't knock doors. Or we should have bought radio ads in Black communities and we decided not to do that. Like, it won't be stories about how they got it wrong. It'll be a story about, oh, Black women didn't do what they were supposed to do. I think, to Dr. Dow's point, I also worry about the idea that we're supposed to do all the work and that I think they think we're supposed to be silent about it. And so I'd be totally shocked if we got anything else other than Harris in terms of like Black woman representation, symbolic or substantive. I think that some of the people who still like make the biggest decisions in the party have a notion of, I gave you this thing, and so now that you have this thing, you need to go sit down. And so I think, to answer the question, people expect Black women to be everything to everybody. And I think they don't expect us to have feelings. They don't expect us to be keeping tabs on like, hey, I gave you 7 things. Can I have 1 back? And I think that's a problem. I think the other expectation is just hard. Like, I expect my mayor to do things that will be helpful to Black people. I expect my soror, my chapter soror, Keisha Lance Bottoms, to do things that will be helpful to Black people. But she, like Muriel Bowser and all of these other people who I described, are constrained. And so like, how do I balance my attempt to try to hold politicians accountable with my excitement with all the constraints that I know they have? And I think that there is some expectation for the mayors I mentioned, and potentially for Senator Harris, to be able to do everything and to have no support to do that.
So when we look at Black women politicians, what do we typically see? Do we see a woman who is Black or a Black woman? Is there a difference?
Dr. Ellison, can I ask a question that piggybacks on yours? And thank you for asking that question. I'd like to ask, particularly since you both have raised Atlanta and DC, right? You've at least got one other point of reference in terms of how you operate as a Black mayor in these spaces, right? So in Atlanta, it was Shirley Franklin, also a Howard alum, and well, Howard's everywhere, right? And in DC, Sharon Pratt Kelly, also a Howard alum, right? I'm wondering if, how is it different? You know, in terms of the challenges of governing, were Franklin and Pratt Kelly in a place where they could in fact be more responsive to a Black electorate because of the demographics of the cities that they were leading at the time, so that they face challenges that are really very different from what Bowser and Lance Bottoms are looking at this point? I'm just interested in the comparison, if there is one.
It's interesting you said X, because I interviewed former Mayor Pratt Kelly for my research. And it's been a while ago, so I don't want to misquote, because I don't want to say like, wait a minute, she did say this, but I can say this about the women that I've interviewed across the country who either currently serve either as on a city council, a mayor, school board, state rep, or they have served in some capacity. One of the things that they all have said, and I do remember this about Mayor Pratt Kelly, is that they talked about that there's a fine line, right? That they bring their Black womanhood to this, but they are also navigating not only white spaces, they're navigating Black men. And so that was always something that came up as well. And they're navigating these stereotypes, they're navigating the business. And so there's like this constant wheel about who am I supposed to be right now in this moment, because I've got to get buy-in from these different people who think of me in all these different ways and want something very different from me. And so there's a different level of mental gymnastics that they are performing when it comes to doing their job. But I think even looking at Kelly, and that was what, 20 years, it's been a long time. It's been a long time, right? And looking at what these women told me just in this over the summer is that what they're bringing in, what they told me that there's multiple things here. Their Black womanhood, their community is what put them in the position. They understand that very clearly. Many of them talked about they didn't even have to buy yard signs because someone ran into them in the store and say, "Hey, you don't have signs. I'll give you a donation right now. Go get your signs." So they recognized that the resources to even win where it was coming from, right? And they also recognized once they got into those positions what they were faced with. Several of them you talked about from the day they were inaugurated, just how aggressive the media became with them, how aggressive, during their orientations, people, were talking to them. So all these personal interactions, then you get to trying to get something done. But what I will say this, and I don't want to ramble, but what these women all told me was that they learned how to be extremely strategic. They learned how to navigate the rules. They learned how to navigate potential supporters. They learned how to navigate and find allies, even when they thought a particular person or group would not be an ally. They even learned how to navigate particularly in legislators, these bills, and a bill that maybe seemed very, nobody would notice it, nobody would address it. They would think, oh, that's just a random every old day type of bill. They even learned and was very strategic about, I'm going to add a rider to this because this is going to address something that may not be very big to you, but in my community, this is very important, right? And so I think what these women recognize is that they have to, like Black women do, go above and beyond in serving, but they are extremely strategic. And I think that's something we don't talk about. We talk about the community piece and we talk about this identity of Black women, but we don't talk a lot about the strategies that they're doing and utilizing and that they're developing, right? Because nobody's telling them how to be a Black woman in the legislature, right? Nobody's telling them how to be a Black mayor of a city that is one of the most popular cities in the country, right? Nobody's telling them how to do this. A lot of times they're learning these things on the fly. But I think we have to begin to look at how they're doing this, particularly from a strategic level. And I think we also have to, when we see certain relationships and we like, why did she do that? There's usually a backstory as to why she did what she did, right? It's always not about, well, they sold the community out or they did. There's usually something else that is happening. And many of these women share these stories. There was something else that happened that they had to make a conscious decision. For this vote, I'm going this direction, but it's not what, the reason that people think it is. But I think to Keneshia's question or comment about space, where's the space for them to communicate that to us? There's not a space unless you're, on the record, and there, a lot of times women say, take this off the record, and they would tell everything. But they're like, they don't have the space to come back to the community and say, you know what, this is why I had to vote this way. Because I knew this next vote was going to be the one that was going to really hurt you. Right. And so where do we give them the space? And one of the things I think as a community, we have to not hold these women hostage, because I think we do. It's fine to have expectation. I expect you to do certain things, but I think we have to start thinking as strategic and as savvy as they are forced to do. Right. And how do we help our community understand those things so that when it's time for election or re-election, we're not ready to throw this person out when they may have had to make some really, really hard decisions. And what could have happened could have been much worse than what they prevented.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. They have to be strategic, and then they have to be strategic, and it's very complicated. So the answer to answer your question about like how these people compare, I would need to like write a book, which kind of Pearl is doing, right? But I have to ask, how is the government organized? Is she a mayor who is functionally just a member of the council with the same privileges as the member of the council? Is she a strong mayor, where a strong mayor is defined as the person who gets to appoint all these people, who has a council, but the council may not be as strong? Who is on the council? Is the council full of allies? Is the council full of adversaries? Like, there are all these things that go into calculating what she does, whether she's successful, and how I should respond to her. And so I think that that's part of what I'm trying to signal about, like, it's hard because we have these ideas, sometimes not entirely fair ideas about like the world's going to be a better place once my person gets in, but we don't always know what's happening in the background, to Dr. Dow's point, or understand clearly what the structures are in the places where we live, and understand that the government of Washington, D.C. is entirely different from the government of Prince George's County. And they are both different from the government of Atlanta, which is different from the government of, I don't know, Stone Mountain. Like, it's all different stuff. And so it's hard to know, not hard to know, but it takes a lot of work to do the comparing of them. On the question about whether these people are Black women or women who happen to be Black, I think it depends on the person. And so as you were saying that, I was thinking about Mia Love, who I think happens to be Black, which kind of cut me deep because she's also Haitian, as I am. And I'm like, I want to be hype about you. I want to root for you, but sometimes you do stuff that's not my stuff, right? And so I don't think that she has a notion of like, yo, I'm about to turn Utah into haven for Black women. I think she just doesn't have that. Like, I think she doesn't bring it. I'm not attempting to sound like I'm judging her about that, but it's just not how she exists in the world. And so I think that's a really great question, because there are some people who got Blackness as a thing in the background, and there are some of us who are like, nah, I'm Black kind of first. And so to the point you were making about the woman who's running for governor in Virginia, if she comes from a place that is 97% white, if she has gone to military school, if she's in all these, I don't know her, so I want to be clear about that to the public. Hey. But if she is doing all of those things, it would suggest to me that she might be the kind of person who, I'm a woman. I'm me. I'm an individual kind of thing. And Blackness is somewhere in the background. And so when we evaluate her or have expectations for her, we kind of need to be thoughtful about that, because if she has Blackness somewhere down the street, then you should expect that in addition to all the things that she's going to fight to get, I don't know, schools or health or whatever she cares about done, the Blackness is going to be way down the street after that stuff, or not informing that stuff.
Keneshia, I have a question or comment to that. What's interesting is that in women or people in leadership who Blackness is in the back, and in doing your research, you notice somebody brings Blackness to the forefront. So how do they respond to that, right? And that's interesting to me, because the response can be, I'm going to run to Blackness because I'm hurt right now, I need somebody to protect me, or I'm going to identify or stand with whatever I came into the room with, right? But I think that is interesting because one of the things when I did the interviews, I just sent out a blanket call. I just emailed women and they came back and said, yes, I'll talk to you. Um, and there were several who talked about they were reserved in their blackness, right? They didn't come in the room like, bam, here I am, right? But it was always interesting when they discussed the moments when somebody brought blackness to them, right? It just happened. Like they didn't, they couldn't hide from it because they're in these positions of power. And even if they wanted to shrink, they could not hide from the fact that even if they weren't walking in this blackness, somebody was assuming that they were, right? And I think that's interesting how people respond because even Mia Love, because when she lost, she tried to kind of tiptoe over, and folks were like, you've already made your bed.
Like, nah, girl, you had to be there at the, no.
Yeah, like she did, so she was so far to the right that for many people, it's like, no, you can stay over there. But I think to, the overall idea about, so how do you respond? If your focus is, what, I'm going in, I just want to do my job. This is my issue. And I'm not trying to be Maxine Waters. I'm not if you're going in not being Maxine Waters, but someone expects you to be Maxine Waters and someone is going to approach you like you're Maxine Waters, how do you respond to that? But that's another book, huh?
Yeah, I think it is. I don't have any good examples from my book. The one example that comes to mind is a person from Detroit whose name escapes me at the moment, but who was a Howard grad, who was the first Black man to be elected to the city council in Detroit, which is hard because, as I mentioned, with the different ways that cities are organized, Detroit is at large, which means you have to win the whole city. And so he comes to office recognizing that he has to kind of walk this I'm a person first and then I'm Black down the street line. And people approach him like, hey, like you're clearly Black, you should be doing Black stuff. And at first his response is like, no, I represent all people. But then eventually there's like some police brutality that happens and he gets exhausted and is like, no, like I can't do it anymore. And so I don't know the answer to the question of what, I don't know, people should do or how they should exist. But I think that the way America is set up, it's only so many days that you're going to be in elected office before this thing sits at your doorstep and you have to reckon with it, whether you think of yourself as Black first or not.
It's interesting during Shirley Chisholm's presidential announcement speech, and this is just so fortuitous because she stated that, and I quote, "I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of women's movement, although I am a woman and equally proud of that. I am the candidate of the people, and my presence before you symbolizes a new era in American political history." Is this still true? Are we still kind of engaging this whole mantra that was shared by one of our Black women political leaders?
Well, okay. I'm really enjoying listening to the two of y'all. So I feel like my job is to ask questions, right? And one question is, I appreciate what she said, but was it true? Right? Did taking that position come with any added benefits with respect to the people who were neither, I guess, Black nor white women? And the fact that, I mean, from what I recall, right? What I've read, the white women threw her under the bus, right? And the Black men weren't necessarily feeling her. So it's sort of like, it's an interesting statement because in some way she's recognizing that the groups that just looking at her, right, that people might in fact presume some sort of alliance or like membership, those are the groups that in fact made sure that she wasn't going to be successful, and whatever power she had to wield within the Democratic Party itself was undermined by backdoor deals designed to get the white women what they wanted that they didn't think that Chisholm could deliver. And I'm not even quite sure under those circumstances what Black men wanted. It's fairly clear they didn't want Shirley Chisholm, but you all are the political scientists, so I'm merely speculating on that point.
They wanted the seat.
Who beat her? Or who replaced her?
Oh, when she after she left Congress. Yeah.
I don't know.
Look, you gotta look it up, Keneshia.
I'm gonna look it up.
But I think, you know, and I showed the documentary, which that quote is in, and the students love it. That's one of my favorite documentaries. And the students always ask about that quote, right? And because it kind of takes them aback, like, well, what does she mean? And I think, and to Professor Crooms-Robinson's point, I think she's invoking just her humanity. I think she's really trying to invoke that I'm not this object, I'm not this thing, I'm really a person, and I'm experiencing all these issues. So I can't be in one of these boxes. But I don't think she's disregarding her Black woman. I mean, she's not doing that at all. But I think she's really trying to invoke the fact that she was this American citizen and she wanted the fullness of what that meant, right? Which is really what the goal was, right? So when she talks, you know, she goes on and talks about why she was running and what 1972 meant after the Democrats had revamped this structure. What did it mean to show up with delegates? Because that's really what she was talking about. She knew she couldn't win, but she kept talking about these delegates, we've got to have delegates. So she understood the party dynamic better than the men. And she was trying to get them to understand, like, if you don't show up with delegates, you can hate me all you want, you still not getting anything done, right? Because they're going to spit you out and use you, which is what eventually happened, right? They were used to take her out, and then they were used by the party as well, right? But I think that she's invoking her humanity and really making a critique about the party and American society, that even if you put me in these boxes, you still got to deal with all of it. And all of the issues that she was addressing was like, all these are issues that come along with me as this human and this American citizen.
We can continue the conversation, but we're also going to open it up to questions and answers from the audience. Our audience members, if you would put your questions in the chat area, we're happy to engage them. So let's continue the conversation. Yeah,
when I say the seat, I mean they want the presidency, and so I think like one of her closest friends, Delms, is supporting her all the way, but at the end is like, ugh, I kind of need to be able to bring things home to my constituents, which I can't do if we don't win, and I think we're not going to win, and so I kind of need you to step aside. But I never thought about, I'm glad y'all asked, who took her seat after she left the Congress, and it's a Black man named Major Owens, which I
forgot about
was today years old. I will say though, a Black woman currently holds the seat, Yvette Clarke, and so that's kind of the trajectory of that for all the New Yorkers watching. I will say though, I don't think that a Kamala Harris could get up and say that, use that language without it. Like, I think that would have just been not well received at all. And I don't think anybody would have been like, oh yeah, she tried to do humanity. I think these days you have to be like, no, I am a Black woman, and that's what that means, to have a national office or to be running for a national office. I don't know that folks at the state or local level are held to that same standard, but for sure, I don't think that that comment in the context of today works as well.
So we have a question from Ms. Courtney Patterson. Thank you for your questions, Patterson. Provided that Biden-Harris wins this election, how do we begin and further continue to hold them both responsible to fight for our interests?
You want
I
to take
guess
that?
that depends on what interest,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, because I think that in some places it looks like Biden, like with respect to, let's say, the appointment of judges to the federal bench, right? I think that that's an area where, relative to what's going on right now, communities' interests would be furthered, but I'm not sure whether that's like a real community issue. I mean, I think that it is, but if you were to like poll people in I don't know, choose a neighborhood, any neighborhood that's predominantly, I'll go ahead and say predominantly Black. I don't know that the judiciary ends up being an issue, but then if you talk to, let's say, the environmental justice people, some might say, well, don't know. Or you talk to the folks who are concerned about criminal justice and holding prosecutors to account and that sort of stuff, they would probably have a different answer in terms of whether they thought that their interests were going to be furthered. I don't know.
I do like your train of thought around the judges, right? Because that has to be a issue, a pressure issue, if Biden and Harris win, right? Because I'm thinking about if they win and the Senate flips, the first thing that has to be on the table has to be a Voting Rights Act. It has to be. And to revise it, to have it revamped, to address the issues that need to be addressed, you still got to have the judges that are going to uphold it when the challenges come, right? So I think one of the things, and that's the difference between both parties, right? So the Republicans have part of their brand, part of their mantra is judges, 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 and around certain key issues. And I think that's something that Democrats can take away and say, we've got to start having a conversation about this. Not when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away and everybody's like, oh, well, wait a minute. Because one of the things that I think where Democrats are missing the mark is when Barrett yesterday said Roe v. Wade wasn't precedent, then what else isn't precedent? Is it Brown? Right? We already know the Civil Rights Act is already gone, Voting Rights Act. What else is not precedent as far as these statutes? So I think the Democrats has now got to shift and incorporate that into the party line, because the judges is important. If we're talking about criminal justice, environmental justice, education, because that's what they're going to court. And they know they can go to court because of what McConnell and Trump have done over the last 4 years. So how do you counter that? You've got to have the judges. You've got to have. So I think that's the issue. I think if they win and healthcare has to come back on the table because it has to be revised. One of the things that's very interesting is that I think people don't know the dynamics of how the ACA even came together and who was at the table. There's a great book, 100 Years of Obamacare, which really chronicles the diverse voices that were there, even though the bill didn't look the way that we wanted it to look, which is why it has to be addressed now because of what they couldn't do. I think bringing diverse groups back to the table, but then having people on the outside demanding that you don't kowtow to the pharmaceutical companies, right? So I think there has to be pressure points at both ways. So you have to, I think, what are your issues, to your point, but then also where there's opportunity to have the groups and the people at the table, we've got to demand that as well. So I think it has to be we've got to have a more robust, holistic politics now than just voting Biden, Harrison. It has to be complete, it has to be the judges, it has to be the activists, it has to be all the groups. When it is time for responses to legislation, we've got to respond. It just has to be fully holistic because so many holes have been punched in the apparatus to protect us and help us that we've got to just have, has to be all hands on deck in every aspect of government and engagement. And so I think all those are, there's no one way, because if you go one way, we're gonna end up back here again.
Yeah, and I want to throw an additional thing into the mix, which is subnational government. And so the Republicans, I think, have been masterful in their doing of politics in that they saw this court thing as a way to be like, well, we'll get you in the back end, but also have state legislatures doing tremendous work that on a day-to-day basis upsets our lives. And while we are focused heavily on Biden Harris, they are focused on like making these laws at the state level. And so part of the organization has to also include being thoughtful about what's happening in your state legislature and making noise with your state legislative officials where they can actually hear you almost immediately, which is different from trying to get the president of the United States to hear you, which will take a very large grouping of folks to kind of move something.
Okay, and I wanted to also still focus on this Harris-Biden communion. And I'm often wondering, now that Senator Harris has been named by VP Biden as his running mate, do you think that the nation in general will re-examine the kinds of, and I call them isms, that have been acceptable narratives and stigmas relative to Black women in politics, isms such as namely racism, sexism, colorism, and one that I'm often curious about, angerism. And I think that such isms have habitually been put forth as negative images relative to Black women in politics. What do you think about that, the intersectionality regarding these isms? And do you think that they will play a role, or do they continue to play a role in Black women politics?
Yes, I think they will play a role. I think they will continue to play a role. I'm not exactly sure. It feels to me like things are building, but it feels to me like that because I like to think about stuff in 50-year periods. And so it feels like we are thinking about racism and thinking about sexism and those two isms in particular more now, and talking about them more now than at, I don't know, a point 50 years ago. And so I think if anything, her being there will kind of shift, I hope that it'll shift the floor, at least shift the floor on the dialogue that we can have. And so I don't think that when I say something or pose a question about something being intersectional, people are gonna be like, what is that? I think we could just start from a higher level of thinking and talking for those of us who are trying to do that than we might have before. I think what we have seen in this presidential administration and in the backlash that follows Barack Obama is that some of that higher level thinking and higher order thinking ends up being like fought against from the right. And so we arguing about whether systemic racism is a thing. It's like, yay, cheers for systemic racism and critical race theory being things that we're talking about, but are we really talking about them in this way? And what problems arise from talking about them in this way? And so I think that the isms won't go away. I think that her presence will change how the conversation happens. I'm hopeful that at least on the left, the conversations will happen in a manner that is more evolved, where we don't have to argue with people about the mere presence of things because they now take us to be telling the truth. But I also worry that some folks in the right will be using that elevated conversation about these isms as a way to further divide people who would be our natural allies.
Okay. And we have a question here. How can elected officials at all levels, federal, state, and local, committed attention and public resource to changing the legal, administrative, and social frameworks that contribute to officer misconduct in this country?
I think we're all thinking about that one.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about it myself. And we have 2 minutes to respond.
Well, one thing I will say is that on the local level, we have to vote. We have elected officials, mayors, ADs, all of these people elected in some municipalities with less than 10% of the vote. Right. And so I think that right there, this enthusiasm we see with people standing in line, we got to stand in line when the city council elections come, because that's where these things are managed. It is managed on the local level, right? And so I think that's the most expedient way right there, is that we've got to stay involved on the local level, so that we can prevent as much as possible the incidents that we have seen, particularly with Breonna Taylor, with that coming, happening again. We've got to vote and engage on the local level.
Okay. Panelists, we have roughly 1 minute. And in this 1 minute time, when we talk about highs and lows of political life for Black women in America, can each of you give me one high word and one low word as we close out this panel?
My high word is powerful. My low word is tired.
Okay. Dr. Grant?
I think my high word would be progress. My low word would be, I don't know, I got to pass by all the inappropriate low words. My low word would be, I don't know, it'd be something like schemes, or, nefarious something. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm not good at the one word.
Okay. Professor Crooms-Robinson.
I think, my high word is seen. My low word isn't really a word. It's part of a word, and it's anti. Right? That's my low partial word.
Okay. Okay. Panelists, thank you so much. Each of you women are phenomenal women. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I am grateful to have been the moderator for this panel. Thank you, and I applaud each of you.
Thank you so much to the panel for being with us this afternoon. And we are concluding the morning session for the conference, and we will be back at 2:30. The panel will be promoting environmental, social, and climate justice at Howard University, Howard Forward. Dr. John Therakin, Dr. Charles Verheeren, Dr. George Mindendorf, Dr. Renelle Hyra, and Dr. David Schwartzman will all be here to talk about environmental and climate justice. I can't thank enough Dr. Dowe, Dr. Grant, Dr. Ellison, Professor Crooms-Robinson. You were all phenomenal, and I just really learned so much from this panel. We had great attendance here and a lot of viewers on Facebook Live. This session has been recorded and will be available on the Howard Homecoming website. And there will be the recordings of all the panels for the next 3 days, and writing from our conference participants that really seeks to capture this moment, Howard Forward advocacy, and the work from protest to policy. Thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. You as well. Be safe and well, each of you.
Bye.